Welcome everyone to today's panel discussion at the Virtual Fintech Forum. My name is Leonie Tier. I'm counsel in the Banking and Finance team at King & Wood Mallesons. I specialise in regulatory law and ESG. And I'm going to be chairing today's discussion on the topic of blockchain's role in achieving the UN's Sustainable Development Goals in finance. And to do that, I'm joined today by two blockchain and crypto experts, Hugh Madden and Mark Blick. And I'm going to just pass over to them one by one to introduce themselves briefly. So Hugh first, please.
Sure. I'm Hugh Madden, the Group CEO of BC Technology Group, which is a listed company in Hong Kong on the main board. And we're the owner of the digital asset powerhouse, OSL, which is Hong Kong's only Type 1 and Type 7 licensed digital asset firm in Hong Kong. Additionally, I've been in the industry for many years, and it also coincides with a long-term keen interest in carbon markets and all things ESG. So thanks for having me today.
Thank you, Mark.
Hi, Leonie. My name is Mark Blick. I'm CEO of Diginex Solutions. Diginex, we're a disruptive impact tech business helping companies or organizations broadly address the world's most pressing ESG and sustainability issues. We use a whole range of technologies, but in particular, we utilize blockchain technology in our attempts to lead change and increase transparency. We've either worked on very large governmental projects for US government, UK government, or Thai, Philippine governments, or at the corporate level, helping people get more transparency in their global supply chains, or helping small and mid-cap enterprises with their ESG reporting. Everything we really do is around data management, and we look at the three phases of data collection. How do I aggregate and surface data? How do I move that into an environment where it can be audited and investigated? And then ultimately, how do I publish and report that data in a meaningful way?
Fantastic. Thank you both very much, and thank you for joining me. I'm really looking forward to this discussion today. So we're going to be talking about blockchain and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. So briefly, the SDGs are a list of 17 goals that were set in 2015 to be achieved by 2030. And essentially, they're an urgent call for action for all countries, both developed and developing countries, to join a global partnership to end poverty, end hunger, improve health and education, reduce inequality, and whilst doing that at the same time, the huge task of tackling climate change. So they're ambitious targets, and meeting those targets, achieving those goals, will require finance to the tune of trillions of US dollars. So we're going to be looking at the role that blockchain can play in there. And before I move on to whether blockchain can in any way help the environment, and we know that's quite a topical issue at the moment, I just want to sort of think about the other SDGs. So the first two SDGs are to end poverty and to achieve zero hunger by 2030. And others speak sort of generally achieving equality for everybody. Now, an absolutely fundamental enabler to achieving all of those goals, and this is very much recognised by the UN, is achieving financial inclusion. Financial exclusion is estimated to impact around 2 billion people worldwide. And what that means is that those people do not have access to even the most basic of financial services. So effectively, they don't have a bank account. And what that means is that they can't save for their futures. They can't invest in their children's educations. They can't invest in innovation, in the tools and technology that they need to use the resources that are available to them to achieve sustainable lives for themselves. They can't save to protect themselves and safeguard against financial shocks that happen on a regular basis to us all. And the causes of that financial exclusion are varied, but generally relate to geographic barriers. So simply, they live in remote and rural areas where they cannot access a bank. Or it may be that they simply lack the identity documents. They don't have a birth certificate or a passport that would enable them to walk into a bank and open a bank account to pass those KYC hurdles. Or they just distrust massively the governments of the countries that they're in and the financial institutions that are available to them. And I think blockchain can play a real role here, because it can offer a decentralized global bank account to those individuals that otherwise cannot access the financial services that are otherwise available to people like you and I. It also it reinforces trust. It is by its very nature trustworthy technology. There's no single authority controlling the ledger. That's really important for people who just have this sort of massive inherent distrust. They can also see what's happening with their money. It provides transparency, so you know it's not being sort of funneled off into the back pocket of a government official somewhere. It also allows for a higher level of low value transactions. So for those migrant workers that move overseas, but they want to send money back to their home communities, to their families, they can do that at a much cheaper rate by cutting out the clearinghouses and the debit and credit card costs. And also work in partnership, and already is working in partnership with digital identity solutions. So there are already blockchain solutions out there that allow people to create profiles based on their biometrics that can then allow them to verify their identity so that they can open accounts and they can access financial services. A great example of this being used already is the UN's building block solution. And that's used in refugee camps around the world, where refugees can go into the grocery store in a refugee camp, they can go to the checkout to get the food and aid that they need. And their iris is scanned at the checkout, and that is then automatically linked to the ledger and to their linked accounts, so they are able to access those sort of the aid that they need without having to rely on cash and food vouchers, which isn't safe. So by offering a solution to the problem of financial inclusion, blockchain can play a really big role in achieving certain of those SDGs that aren't environmentally related. So that then brings us on to the environmental SDGs, and there are a number of them, half of them, that relate to climate action, life on land, life under the water, clean energy and sustainable cities. And we know that this is a big push as well for governments. ESG is very much the buzzword for regulators around the world at the moment. China has committed itself to achieving peak carbon emissions by 2030 and being carbon neutral by 2060. Now, for the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, that's a huge goal, and it's going to need a significant amount of finance, not just from the government, but from the private sector. So this is something that I really want to discuss with you both, because I think that in achieving this, we're looking at how, and companies and governments will be looking at how they can measure, reduce and offset their carbon emissions. And I'd be interested to hear how blockchain can help at each of those stages. So when we're talking about green processes and systems and how companies can move themselves to being greener, we're talking about accessing green finance. One of the biggest hurdles for green finance is this lack of harmonized taxonomies and standardization. And I'm really keen to hear how blockchain can sort of help with that issue. We also know that blockchain is, again, it's a cheaper solution to the normal financial solutions. So when you think about issuing a green bond, the average cost of issuing a green bond in this normal sort of traditional way is over $6 million US. It's estimated that for a full blockchain automated issuance of a green bond, the cost is $700,000. So that's almost a reduction of around 90%. Makes it a much more attractive option, and more companies will be looking at their options for issuing green bonds and accessing green finance. And finally, I think we know that carbon markets are going to play a huge role in achieving carbon neutrality. Carbon markets, both voluntary and government-led, are skyrocketing in popularity. There is a nationwide one due to launch next month in Shanghai. And we know that one of the biggest problems for carbon trading is double counting of carbon credits. And when we have double counting, it undermines fundamentally the greenness that we can get from carbon trading and the good that can come from that. So we have all of this sort of possibility and opportunity that I want to discuss with you, but I have to set the scene, which is to sort of set the other side of the coin. And that is the things that we're hearing, and particularly this sort of blown up on social media lately, thanks to Elon Musk, which is basically that it can't be good for the environment, that it is inherently bad. So just a couple of things I've read over the last few days. A single Bitcoin transaction uses the same amount of power that the average American household consumes in a month. Cryptocurrency uses as much electricity as Argentina. And a single Bitcoin transaction leaves a carbon footprint of 360 kilograms compared to only 500 milligrams for your average Visa transaction. And on that note, I'm going to move to the panel for my first question, which is for you, Hugh. So we have Elon Musk telling us that Bitcoin is inherently bad for the environment, and others saying that it's doing more for renewables than any other government. we also hear that Ethereum is slowly moving to a proof of stake model. So what are your views on that debate? And are there any types of blockchain proofs that are sort of better than others?
Sure, and yeah, very topical, and frankly, I'm very pleased to see this come to the mainstream thought process. It's been a long time coming. You know, I started these conversations back in 2014, where I knew some mining companies, Bitcoin mining companies, moving to Iceland in order to take advantage of renewables and natural cooling. And I knew, and I've seen innovations from the mining industry leak into energy savings and clean energy projects in the non-crypto world. So I think this has been an ongoing discussion point of interest for a long time, but it's only just now hit mainstream awareness. And as usual, it's done so without any nuance whatsoever. I think you've seen energy consumption is bad, and proof of work is the culprit, Bitcoin, and you've seen all cryptocurrencies and all digital assets, all blockchains, they all seem to be tarnished with the same brush. But as you mentioned, certain types of blockchains just don't have that issue at all. Proof of stake being one, but there's actually many different kinds. But certainly the two most famous, Bitcoin and Ethereum, make use of proof of work. And as you rightly point out, Ethereum has been trending towards proof of stake, and we'll get there. We'll get there in some time. So it's hard to deny that Bitcoin proof of work in its current form leaves a footprint, and that does need to be addressed. Now, there's been an interesting dialogue as we've seen China. We've seen China, of course, ban miners with a comment on their environment, which is interesting because China's been starting to set some quite transparent goals with regards to their climate action, unlike many other countries like my own. I hail from Australia, and embarrassingly, they've been very reticent to set any targets. But that said, most people, myself included, think this is actually excellent for Bitcoin, because what it's going to do is push it out of markets where there's no transparency, and in other markets as they mature, I see carbon neutral. Already it's kind of a must from a peer pressure perspective, but I think soon governments worldwide will make it mandatory. The thing I find a little bit ironic, though, is so many of these public figures will criticize, the carbon footprint of Bitcoin without actually stopping and looking at all their industry and committing to targets for the entire country. So for me, this question is more a question of, should all industries be required to have a carbon neutral footprint? And the answer there is yes. Now, there's also unintended consequences. So it's always, it can be a bit of a risk just to take a broad stroke approach to things, because you do see innovations and opportunities coming out of the energy consumption. Energy consumption by itself is not a bad thing, and it can actually lead to an increase in investment in renewable infrastructure. One of the interesting things about Bitcoin mining machines that use proof of work is they're interruptible, or they can be turned off. And so they're an excellent way of earning revenues for renewable infrastructure, where it has excess power that can't be stored in expensive battery architectures, and it's not during the peak cycle. So it can actually lead to an increased funding and an increase in renewable infrastructure. So overall, I think it's an extremely valid point, and I hope to see all Bitcoin mining firms and other Bitcoin firms, like I already have, go carbon neutral. And I think that's kind of matches the sentiment of the born digital generation, which frankly are the main stakeholders we're talking about here.
Thank you. So yeah, you've just mentioned that you have offset your carbon footprint, that you've managed to do that for your company. Can you tell us a bit about how you've achieved that?
Sure. So I didn't know it was going to be so topical, to be honest. As a public company, we do have ESG obligations, but I wanted to go well and beyond reporting obligations and make it part of our core culture. So I sponsored our ESG committee, and one of the first things I wanted to do, frankly, a bit of a personal belief, is I wanted us to become carbon neutral. And at the time, many of the consultants were educating us on how to do carbon in a listed company, they're kind of saying, well, you know, you've got to do a materiality assessment, and and it's all very, very solid advice. What goals or initiatives are suitable for your stakeholders and your type of company, and that's where you should focus. But I was a bit stubborn, and I was like, yes, we're going to do them, but first we're going to do carbon, and I was particularly wanted to do that with a blockchain-based carbon technology. And so in the end, we did a bit of a search, and I didn't find as many projects as I would have liked. But I'm aware of many kind of under development. But we found a project we liked where the carbon credits had been tokenized using a SPV, tokenized, tradable on a blockchain, which in our view is actually the perfect technology for a global frictionless market like carbon markets need to be. And of course, blockchain technology also providing the much needed transparency and assurance that maybe we'll talk about shortly. So I found some assets where the project has been reviewed by one of the standards bodies. We bought the assets. A listed company, you compute all aspects of your carbon footprint. So we basically bought more than we needed in terms of tons of carbon offsets, and then we burnt half of them, which was enough to give us a carbon neutral footprint for the past 3 years, which coincidentally is the time in which we've been in control of this particular listed company. Now, and what's really nice about that is excellent assurance and data quality on a public blockchain to see those transactions. We can point people at it. We can point our investors at it, and you can also see the burn or the retiring of that asset. And it's more than just a paper ledger that gives people assurance. There's no rehypothecation. It's distinctly recorded on a blockchain, so you can be very sure those assets were indeed retired. So I think a perfect application for blockchain, and now we're in several discussions to bring more such instruments to the market because we think they'll be very popular.
Fantastic, well done. So my next question then for you, Mark, is I mentioned before about green finance and one of the biggest challenges being the current lack of harmonised taxonomies and standards that you need to avoid greenwashing. So how can blockchain help with that?
I think there are two separate parts of that question. I think starting from mid-1970s onwards and really from this century, you saw how the international financial reporting standards standardized the way in which we reported on financial indicators. And now what you're seeing is growing demands for greater transparency and standardization of non-financial indicators. And this is very early foothills of this. So the non-financial sustainability reporting coming from all the competing frameworks out there like GRI, SASB, and TCFD. And this is all driving the need for a technology solution. At the most macro level, you have a company like Tesla that gets an A for reducing carbon emissions from diesel vehicles, gets a C for using batteries which are hard to recycle, and gets an F for using cobalt and from mines in Congo that potentially use child labor to extract it. So it gets very confusing when you look at these non-financial indicators. And then you have a very key opportunity for a solution, an automation of a solution that provides consistent and reliable sustainability reporting at a reasonable cost. And this is where we started looking at how can technology help with this. And for blockchain, I mean, I like, as people who work with me know, I like using analogies. And a bit like when you're driving a car, if you get into an accident, there's a good chance you're going to get hurt. But you put together the brakes, the seatbelt, and the airbags, and you increase the chances that you're going to walk away unscratched. Similarly, with our efforts of data collection, if we just collect data and put in no checks and balances, then that data is largely unreliable. But if you can start putting in checks and balances, for example, standard deviation alerts, evidentiary documentation, multi-party verification, and also blockchain technology, that helps the robustness of the collection in which that data is then shared amongst multiple parties. Everything that we do on our platforms, I think this is always a common misconception that stuff is put on the blockchain when it isn't. It's put on a server somewhere, but the action associated with that stuff is then timestamped and put onto a blockchain. So when we go through our data collection process, and you can imagine yourself as as a small company that's wanting to get better at its reporting and present to investors or consumers or regulators a more standardized way in which they're reporting their ESG or their sustainability indicators. And to date, they've struggled because they've been using Excel spreadsheets, which of course have no governance or auditability to them, or very little anyway. So how do you put tools in the hands of companies that were once only affordable to the largest companies of all? And we've really looked at this in terms of, to have impact at scale, it's not about getting the big companies to do more. That's part of it, but it's allowing all the smaller and mid-cap enterprises who haven't previously been able to afford the tools that would enable them to have robust reporting on things like non-financial reporting indicators to external parties, so that when that external party sees the information that they get, they have more trust in it. It's something we learned from our supply chain business a lot, which is when folks know that they are potentially held accountable to the data that they've entered, because there's going to be an event log of who entered in what information at what point and who deleted that information and so on and so forth, which is then shared amongst multiple parties who will all have the same copy of that event log. It's a little bit like a digital panopticon. You have that multi-party lens on specific data sets. Then folks will take data entry a lot more seriously. And what you end up with is a set of reports on sustainability or on ESG, which can be trusted a lot more. And we really wanted to create tools that will enable all companies and all organizations of no matter what budget or very limited budget to be able to participate in.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Hugh, just back to you then. I want to revisit what you were saying about carbon markets. Carbon trading is such a really big role in helping countries to achieve their commitments under the Paris Agreement. So what role do you think blockchain plays when it comes to carbon markets?
I think there's two main roles here. Probably the first and foremost is assurance. So as a listed audited company, audited by a Big Four auditor, I'm used to extremely rigorous, assurance and audits, which gives trust to our investors and our clients. And as a blockchain company, I think blockchain takes that to an extreme level. So our auditor, as part of the audit process, goes through all of our financial records, and everywhere there's a blockchain transaction, which for our business is a lot of those transactions, they can go and independently verify, and they do, every single one of those transactions against public blockchain data. Now, I don't think there's any other type of company in the world where you can trust the work of the auditor as much because of that fact. So much of our financial record is independently, checked against this public data sources. That's the beauty of blockchain. Now, when I started, down the path of our carbon neutral work and our ESG initiatives, I was kind of like, okay, so who's our auditor for ESG? Now, who's the auditor that's going to come in and they check everything we do and tick it off and provide that level of trust and corporate governance that you'd expect? And the answer is, well, actually, right now there's no such thing. You can't do that. You can't go and get an auditor to go and audit your ESG work and give everyone that comfort. And as a result of that, once I started looking at some of the carbon credit options, I met a firm called All Infra, and I recently announced that we invested in All Infra, because what these guys were doing is they were recording raw renewable energy data as it's produced. As a wind farm produces units of energy, they'll take those readings and directly stamp them onto a blockchain. So you have all these raw readings of actual energy being produced, renewable energy. Then they'll go and package up these packages of data into tokens, which can be packaged up into carbon credits. Now, the quality of these instruments from an assurance perspective or a data lineage perspective, you know that those tokens haven't been rehypothecated, and you can track their lineage all the way down to actually the hour and the amount of clean energy that was produced. I think that's an amazing level of data quality and assurance, and you need that in this industry. So there has been the odd scandal in the ESG and the carbon space, in previous years. And it's one of the risks actually that consultants will tell you. Be careful, do your due diligence. You may think you're doing the right thing, you support or you invest in the right project, and it ends up there was fraud involved or there was quality issues. And so actually you might end up doing yourself more brand damage than good. And so you really need to do your due diligence, and you need strong assurance. And I think blockchain plays a perfect role there. But that said, the other thing is, I'm not really a big believer in replacing old markets with old instruments with new technology. It doesn't really make sense. Like they kind of many of the old financial instruments, they kind of work all right. And actually, but meanwhile, there's new growing markets. And I think carbon will go through a massive resurgence in years to come. Now, so we've got this large growing market. Now that's largely happening because even though some of the older generations may not be as committed to climate actions, I think in surveys globally, the younger generation has a very different attitude. And so as you see the millennials and the born digital parts of the population growing into leadership roles, you will see countries worldwide play a much faster role in carbon markets. Now, the funny thing about that particular client segment, they also have no issues with owning and consuming purely digital assets. They do it all day long. It's very, very natural and native. On top of this, that client segment likes to consume services globally, make their own choice, and do it 24 hours a day. These are all aspects of blockchain technologies and markets that have been created on blockchains. And that's hence my two interests. Blockchain is very good at the quality and assurance. Blockchain is the obvious technology of choice for these new markets as they grow, given the types of consumers they're going to be interacting with that market. And that's why I've been pleased already to consume some of these carbon tokens, and I look forward to creating and issuing many more options in the future.
Thank you. Mark, I'll come back to you then. What would you say are the greatest obstacles to meaningful impact at scale for SDG adoption? And how does blockchain help to overcome those?
So I'll take SDG adoption also more broadly as sustainability adoption. This is something we look at a lot. I think paradoxically, it's sustainability industry itself. I think if you go back 10, 15 years ago, you have BlackRock and Fidelity putting pressure on General Motors and Philip Morris to get better at their sustainability reporting, or their adherence to SDGs hadn't come out then, but along those lines, to get better at being externally reporting on the factors that their company impacts the world at large beyond financial indicators. And to a large extent, these large companies have done that, and they've hired in-house sustainability teams who have gone out and done large studies, and they've got large billboards at airports with children and watering cans and green shoots coming out from deserts and stuff like that. So the industry that then sprung up to support that tended to be sustainability consultants selling expensive sustainability consultancy services to in-house sustainability consultants. And it was a very circular conversation. And these were also true believers in the topic, and probably quite rightly so. So they did often believe that as large private companies, that these companies had done lots of bad things. And so the penance for this should be that this process should be expensive. It should take a long time. It should be disruptive to a company's organizations. And then you fast forward to the last 3 or 4 years, and that pressure for disclosure and ESG reporting has really rolled downhill very quickly to small and mid caps, who generally don't have large teams, don't have large budgets. 5 years, and we spend all of our time talking to these types of companies. 5 years ago, the CFO of your average mid cap probably thought ESG was a new hire who sat in the marketing department. And now you go forward, and I think everyone realizes it's now a thing, it's here to stay, I'm going to have to report on it. And they go out into the market, and then what they find are an industry that treats them as if they know what they're already talking about, which in many cases they don't. They're very new to this topic, and it's intimidating, and it's difficult to get over. And it's expensive. You're looking at tens of hundreds of thousands of dollars for a report, and it's going to take 6 months, and it's going to be disruptive to the company. So how do you get these guys who, when they go in the market and they're presented with that, they're going to say, you know what, I'll do this next year. I'll push it off 1 more year. How do you bring that forward and reduce the obstacles for adoption by as many people as possible? And that's where we've really looked at technology. And I'll give you a great example of, again, analogy. I'm not a website designer, so I'm not good at that stuff. And 4 or 5 years ago, if you'd asked me to design a website, I would have said, I can't do that. Please go to our website team. But then a company like Wix.com came along, and I was able to go on, and they had the building blocks for you, and they did use technology to do a lot of the heavy lifting around something really complex. And that really complex thing was website design. And here also, you should use technology and product to overcome something which is really complex and intimidating to those people that have never done it before. Sustainability reporting is intimidating if you look at how to do a GRI core competency report. It's really complex, it's difficult. So how do you use technology in order to make that simple? And then to go back to points which I've made and Hugh's made earlier around trust in the data and leveraging blockchain to give greater assurance in the information that you're providing, so that when you do produce that report that you've used technology to help complete, that when people consume that report, they're going to have a high degree, and whether that's investors, regulators, your auditor, whomever it may be, they'll have a high degree of trust in the data that they're seeing, because you've gone through a process of event logging every step that you've taken and gone out for multi-party verification and assurance and so on and so forth, and reduce the likelihood that people haven't taken that data collection process seriously. So we look at a lot of what is the biggest barrier? Well, it's often just the barrier to entry. It's hard. So how do you reduce that as much as possible and leverage technology in its broadest possible sense, but also blockchain technology, and putting tools in the hands of companies that 3 years ago wouldn't have dreamt that they'd be able to complete this type of exercise without going out to market and spending lots of money on a consultant.
Thank you. And just finally, Mark, because I'm interested to hear about this from you, I know it's a topic that you know a lot about, just before we wrap up, what role can blockchain play in achieving the sort of ESG roles, the sustainable roles that relate to human rights violations or eradicating human rights violations?
This is where we started 4 years ago, and I'm sure Hugh will remember this. Blockchain was even newer than it is now, and you walked into a conversation with a regulator or a government official or whomever, and they would say something like, "Oh, it can remove plastic from the world's ocean," or "I had the same carbon emission as Argentina," I think was something, the thing you mentioned earlier. One of those two things was extreme at either end, and we really wanted to be able to identify fundamentally good projects that would help validate the technology and create a much more interesting narrative, so that when people said the type of thing about removing plastics or carbon emissions or stuff, we'd say, well, that's great, but let's walk you through some work that we're doing, some really serious work that will have positive societal impact. And I went through a long period of looking at every different possible blockchain application before accidentally coming across this issue of modern slavery and human rights. And it was together with an organization actually here in Hong Kong called the Mekong Club who introduced us to this topic. And really it's on two components. One, you have this big issue around fraudulent documents, fraudulent medical certificates, fraudulent visas, a lack of transparency of what fees are being collected and reimbursed, and so on and so forth. So a mess around data collection. So at a migrant worker side, from a migrant worker or individual side, how do we reduce the potential of someone being exploited as they move from one country to another in search of work in the supply chains of some of the world's largest companies, by empowering them with much more security over the documentation that's most important to them? So things like their contract, and to prevent that from being substituted, and allowed that to be verified and assured at multiple stages. So that was really important, to have that in the hands of migrant workers. But also from the company side. So how do I prevent a company from appearing on the front page of the Wall Street Journal for using forced labor in factories in Myanmar and Bangladesh or wherever it may be? And really the real value add, and as far as I have seen there, even in the world's most complex companies, the real value add lies in a move away from a paper-based process. I mean, the fact that you would use an orchestrated workflow with a bunch of market participants that happens to use DLT, that gives you some better cryptography, and it gives you some interesting workflow options and some deterministic computation, but it's really just a design choice. What we really look for as a first question is, where is there an inefficient, typically paper-based process that has a high error rate and is potentially open to fraud? How can we then create digitally native data or digitize existing data sets and then decide how to store that data? And I'll give you a very recent example. We're working with a company. That manufacturing facility is mind-blowingly futuristic. You walk into the factory and it runs 24/7, 365 days a year. and that there's one worker at the beginning of the production line who switches the on button, and there's another worker at the other end of the production line who switches the off button, and everything else is automated and robotic, and that's fantastic. But then you have lots of people who are involved in things like logistics. So a company that's as evolved as this, with the latest in manufacturing technology, still onboards all of their workers using a clipboard, a piece of paper, and a pencil, and takes down notes and then puts it in the filing room. And I saw the filing room. It's this huge cavernous room that if the person who puts the paper in the room in the first place leaves, there's no chance of finding it again. So how do we help digitize that? And how do we help reduce the potential for something to go wrong, or reduce the potential for paper to go missing, or someone to take advantage of things not being kept in a secure way? So it's both at the migrant worker side, providing digitized version of documents that they can take with them and everybody recognizes as a single source of truth. And then at a company level, when this company then that we're working with wants to engage with the Ministry of Labor in the country it's operating in, rather than relying on using this typically paper-based process, being able to connect their two governance systems so they can look at the information that we're now collecting digitally and storing via blockchain. So all of it is about reducing the potential for exploitation as much as humanly possible.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that we are out of time, so we do need to wrap up, but it's been really good to speak to you both. And I think just that half an hour has gone really quickly, but what I'm hearing, and I think what we can safely say is that we know that blockchain can help us to achieve the UN's SDGs, and that is just based on the technology alone. We can, in the way that it can promote financial inclusion, the role that it can play in carbon trading, in standardization, in assurance and trust. And I think that we will see blockchain playing more and more of a role across the sort of ESG industry as we go forward. So thank you both very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.